there's nothing more dangerous to the health of a democracy, of a nation, than its citizens losing its apathy. Now, those were the words of famous philosopher Montesquieu, and let's kickstart this edition of Vantage Point with those very words. Well, this is where we keep you intact with a changing political landscape, and we also educate you as to how you will be affected individually. Well, you will be with me and political analyst Dr. Dayanja Tilaka for the next 1 hour. Is that right?
That's right. That's right.
Thank you very much for joining us. And
thank you, Stephanie.
let's just get down to business.
Sure.
Right? Electing a clean parliament and getting MPs, clean MPs to parliament. Now, that's the idea a lot of people are rallying around with just few days left for the elections. Why do you think there's a sudden urgency, a sudden need for a clean parliament?
Stephanie, I'm not sure there is. Or rather, I'm not sure that, that's the main preoccupation. I'm also not sure whether that's the right preoccupation. So I'm starting off dissenting with your assumptions, from the get-go. I think this election, or the most interesting thing about this election, is the battle for the prime ministership. And we have two personalities, Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe and Mr. Mahinda Rajapaksa. So it's what was called the premier stakes in a famous book decades ago about a similar situation in Sri Lanka. There was a book that was written about, I think it was the 50s, it was called the premier stakes. And that, I think, is what it's about. And that's what I hear when I watch television. It's all about Mahinda and Ranil, rather than about the quality of the parliamentary representatives. Now, that's important, but I think that's a secondary attention getter. That's not what this movie is called. It's called who's going to be the prime minister. Who's going to be the prime minister?
Yeah. So the stakes are high, definitely
very high. Very high.
So the next 5 years,
yeah,
this premier will have most of his powers, parliamentary powers, and definitely the president will also have shared powers with the prime minister. So don't you think it should be a combined effort, and whoever is elected to be the prime minister should be able to work with the president cordially? So whom do you think will be the perfect candidate for that?
Well, I'm not sure it should be a combined effort in that sense. I believe in balance rather than combination. Combination is good.
So who will strike that balance?
Let me back up a bit. Take the United States. You have a Democratic president and a Republican Congress. Problems, but no big deal. It's happened many times. In France, they coined this term cohabitation. It's where you have the presidency from one party and the prime minister and the legislature dominated by another party. So we might have that situation in Sri Lanka. We might not. Now, we also have new rules of the game. We have the 19th Amendment. This is the first post-19th Amendment election, which rebalances the Constitution. So you have a president who's less powerful than he or she used to be, and a prime minister who will be more powerful than any PM has been since 78. It really depends on voter perception. Now, the voter might think, look, I'm not really interested in how the equation president-prime minister goes. I just want this guy as my PM. Somebody else might think, no, it doesn't matter. And it's better to have somebody who comes from the same party. I mean, Maitri and Mahinda after all are from the same party. Then there would be a third person who thinks, no, it's not the party that counts so much. What's the congruency of views? Isn't it better to have Ranil, who might be on the same page as Maitri? But then again, maybe that's not the question at all, because Prime Minister Wickremesinghe has said during this campaign that if the UNP wins, there will be a brand new constitution. That has also been hinted at by former President Rajapaksa, but it's not a major campaign theme of his. Now, we know that Mr. Wickremesinghe attempted during the 19th Amendment to shift power almost totally from President Sirisena to the Prime Ministership, and that was stopped by the Supreme Court and then again the Parliament, the UPFA in Parliament. So you had a far more modest and moderate 19th Amendment. What I'm saying is, let's say I vote for Ranil Wickremesinghe because I think that he'll get on better with Maithripala Sirisena, but then if he's going to have a new constitution which transfers Maithripala Sirisena's powers to the Prime Ministership, that's not really relevant. It
so
doesn't
there's
matter.
a shift in powers from President to Prime Minister.
Yes, not totally.
But
Ranil wanted a total shift, but what you now have is a kind of a midpoint.
so only when it comes to dissolving Parliament, the Prime Minister will have a say in it with the Parliament's consent. Isn't that how the 19th Amendment works?
No, no. The 19th Amendment means that the President acts, but on the advice of the Prime Minister. So it's a far more balanced situation. It's far more like the French presidency. When President Jawardena, when Prime Minister Jawardena started this rolling and he came out with the 78 Constitution, it was billed by a top political scientist, Professor A.J. Wilson, as the Gaullist system in Asia. That this was Asia's imitation of the French presidential system. Now, that was true. I mean, A.J. Wilson was a very brilliant political scientist, but there were certain anomalies. It wasn't quite the French system. After the 19th Amendment, what you have is something much close to the French system. But Prime Minister Wickremesinghe has said, that he needs a brand new constitution. His spokespersons and fellow ministers like Mangala have said that the 19th Amendment was just an interim measure as far as the UNP is concerned. Mr. Wickremesinghe has also said that he would revert to the Donamo system, which as a political scientist I find a bit of a problem, because the Donamo system was under colonialism and it was seen as totally inadequate, which is why we moved on to the Solberry system. So I don't know why he wants to go back to something that's actually pre-independence. But anyway, if the UNF wins, I really doubt that, but even if it does, then the whole question of somebody who will work together with Maithripala Sirisena becomes irrelevant, because you're going to have a new constitution and President Sirisena will probably be the kind of ceremonial president that Mr. John Amaratunga said he should be when the UNP introduced the 19th Amendment. He said he'd be like William Gopalava. I mean, that was a governor general. So it really won't matter if the UNF wins, whether or not they get on with President Sirisena, because President Sirisena will be a powerless, purely ceremonial president.
Well, Dr. Dayan, to do all of that, he needs the majority in Parliament. He cannot change a constitution completely just because he gets into power. So there's a lot of, clauses, there's a lot of procedure that needs to go through. So what do you think? He cannot have all the powers like he did, or the president did before in the previous administration?
Yes, but there's a catch. I agree with you, but there's a catch. Because some years ago, President Chandrika Bandaranaike Kumaratunga came out with a theory. Now that theory came and went. It's a theory of the constitutional revolution. But I heard it again in January this year, where she and Ranil were talking about a constitutional revolution. Now what does this mean? Why revolution? As somebody was once indicted for being a revolutionary, I was wondering, revolution? What are they talking about? Now, what they meant was that if you go for an election, now this is a strange theory, it's not in political science, it's their theory. If you go for an election, a normal parliamentary election, and say, look, I'm going to have a new constitution, and then you win for whatever reason, then you don't go through the proper constitutional procedures for constitutional change. You don't need the two-thirds, or you say you don't need the two-thirds. Hey, I won the election. And then you have a constituent assembly, you turn parliament into a constituent assembly, and you have your own brand new constitution outside of the procedures laid down in the constitution for changing the constitution. So that is what Chandrika called a constitutional revolution. And that is what Mr. Wickremesinghe also called it in January. So I think that in what I consider the unlikely event of Mr. Wickremesinghe winning, that is the pathway they will use. They will not wait for a two-thirds. They will have a constituent assembly. In fact, that's there in the manifesto. And they would say, hey, this is a constitutional revolution. Mr. Sumandaran said that on your show, on Minna, when he and Mr. Douglas Devananda debated. And what Mr. Sumandaran said is there is an agreement, not a secret agreement, but an unwritten agreement. Not every unwritten agreement is secret. With the UNP, which is for a new constitution that goes beyond unitary, which is no longer unitary. He didn't say it was federal, I have to be very honest. But he said on Minna that they will go beyond the unitary framework, that the UNF and the TNA has agreed, and that he said Prime Minister Modi has also agreed to this. So it will be through a constituent assembly, which does not require two-thirds majority. So that's the bypass that they have in mind.
So what's the whole process to get there?
Just to win the election.
Just to win the election, the Prime Minister will get all the powers to do it?
Correct.
So that means the 19th Amendment allows it?
The 19th Amendment is weighted far more evenly than the earlier situation. So the Prime Minister, if he actually wins an election, will try. I'm not saying it's going to be unchallenged. I'm sure people will go to courts, as they did when he tried to move the 19th Amendment, and who knows what will happen. But this is very clearly, and this has been said by the UNP, this is to bypass a referendum, which is necessary. Usually when you, for instance, if you want to change the unitary character, you have to go for a referendum. That's according to our constitution. But if you basically tear up the constitution and say, I want an election, I'm not going for a referendum. I'm going to have a constituent assembly and a brand new constitution, which doesn't require me to observe the established constitutional methods of change. Then you can have very drastic changes, including by President Sirisena, on the basis of this theory, which was originally Chandrika's theory of a so-called constitutional revolution.
So the Prime Minister will be in power for the next 5 years.
Yeah.
So in the event Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe retains in his position, he will anyway have to give the powers to another person for the next 5 years. So as in once he becomes Prime Minister.
Really? You mean 5 years down the road?
Down the road he becomes Prime Minister and he ends his tenure and he has to give his reins to a different person.
I don't think so. I don't think so, Stephanie. I mean, this is a gentleman who lost elections for 20 years and didn't give up the party leadership, despite the fact that there was a rebellion in the party. This is someone who's going to have a death grip on the party and power.
Than the former Prime Minister having it for over a decade?
Who is the former Prime Minister?
Former President having powers for over.
Yeah, he was re-elected. He was re-elected. He won an election,
but he resorted for a third term.
Then he lost the election. Yeah, he went for a third term, but he went for an election. He didn't say I'm going to stay for life without an election. Because
he was confident that he will win.
No, because he didn't. He changed the rules only in a very small way. That is, there are countries in which you don't have term limits for president. In fact, the United States of America, which everybody knows as a two-term limit, didn't have a two-term limit until way after the Second World War. President Roosevelt ran for 4 terms. He was elected for 4 terms. So there are many countries where there are no term limits. Even in France, the term limits were brought in maybe a decade ago. Otherwise, there was no term limit originally for the French presidency under the Gaullist constitution. So Mahinda Rajapaksa had he removed the term limits, in the sense you could run for any number of terms if you're re-elected. He wasn't re-elected, he went home. Now, the difference between him and Prime Minister Wickremesinghe, if I may say so, is this, and I'm not talking about personality traits. When Mr. Wickremesinghe was Cabinet Minister of the United National Party in the Jayawardena administration, that administration decided not to have a parliamentary election, which was scheduled for early '83. So, after the presidential election was won by President Jayawardena, having earlier disbarred his main opponent, Sirimao Bandaranaike, from running for office, then they decided not to have the scheduled parliamentary election. and to have a referendum instead of a parliamentary election. And it was a very violent referendum, coercive, fraudulent, and Mr. Wickremesinghe was in the forefront of that process, in Parliament, defending it, arguing for it, and on the street, as it were. So, this is the first and only time, thank God, in the history of our country, where a government said, no, we're not going to have a parliamentary election. You don't like it? Tough. That was a fundamental violation of the rules. Mr. Wickremesinghe has yet to say, look, I was wrong. We were wrong. We should never have cancelled the parliamentary election and disempowered the people and had this referendum instead. He has yet to say that. That is the one of the main differences I see between these two. Mahinda Rajapaksa changed the rules, but he went for an election, he lost, he went home. And now he's running for election again.
So what does the future hold for all of us Sri Lankans? Now, we've been through many general elections, presidential elections, so on and so forth. But the country is yet to see a formidable change where we can look up and say, yes, we made history at one point. So what do you think the politicians should do differently so that people's mindset might change about politicians, politics in general?
Well, Stephanie, in a way, we've already had our biggest historic change. You grew up in a country at war, 30 years of war. I mean, look around you, your newscasts, which you do so well. Look at Syria, look at Libya, look at even parts of Pakistan, look at Afghanistan, all over the world. There are countries that live in war, and it's terrible for society. So, in history, there's almost no difference as big as a society which is consumed by a protracted war, long war, and one which has overcome that, which has prevailed, which has won, and moved on to post-war. Now, we had that change in 2009. Now, that's not the only change we need. We need more change. We also need change for the better, not change for the worse. So, the really big change has taken place. Now, I think that you have a choice of futures at this election. Because there are things on the horizon, and I'm not speculating, I'm going on the basis of what's in the media. There are things on the horizon which are independent of Ranil and Mahinda and this fight that we are witnessing now. What are those things? We have Chief Minister Jayalalitha handing a memorandum to Prime Minister Modi, who visited her home for a 50-minute discussion a few days ago. Now, this story, which our media didn't make much of, was in some very important Indian newspapers, such as the Economic Times, which is part of the Times of India group, and it was picked up by many other papers. Chief Minister Jayalalitha didn't just have a chat. She gave a memorandum, as I said, to Prime Minister Modi. What did she say in the memorandum? She urged the Prime Minister to take up the position that India would push for further decentralization of powers so that the Tamils in Sri Lanka would have a Tamil Elam. She says it in a memorandum given to the PM. This is not Jayalalitha on the platform wanting cheers in the middle of an election, saying something which we can say, oh, forget about it. It happens in politics. She gave a memorandum. It says very clearly that the Tamils of Sri Lanka have a right of self-determination, and that India should ensure that even the 13th Amendment is further decentralized so that it is a springboard for the establishment of Tamil Elam. Right? This is in the Economic Times. That's one big thing that's happening out there. There's another big, maybe even a bigger thing that's happening, which is the Indian Minister for Highways, Mr. Nitin Gadkari, stated to the press in June, and his Minister of State, i.e. his deputy, reiterated just the other day, something that has enormous consequences for Sri Lanka. It couldn't be bigger. He said that there are only 23 kilometers of the Pork Straits between India and Sri Lanka, and that India has submitted a project proposal to the Asian Development Bank to be able to bridge this by road, rail, and, I mean, road and rail are cheap. An underwater tunnel which can take ships. And this is from Rameshwaram to Talemana. In other words, Rameshwaram in Tamil Nadu and Talemana in northeast Sri Lanka. Now, what's the cost according to Mr. Gadkari? 3.6 billion US dollars. Now, India is a very rich country, but this is too big even for India, so they've applied to the Asian Development Bank to bridge Sri Lanka and India, especially South India and Northern Sri Lanka. Now, the consequences, I mean, we can have a whole program on that, because if we had been linked to India in that way, I mean, you know the Ramayana and so on, we wouldn't be what we were. We wouldn't be Sri Lanka. We have a natural border, which is a strip of water. We would be just linked to the landmass of the subcontinent with 1 billion people. I mean, nobody speaks our language. I mean, the language of the majority of the people. We wouldn't have a separate existence. We would have tremendous demographic, economic, cultural, religious pressure. In fact, after Emperor Ashoka and the brilliant Buddhist civilization, we know that Buddhism receded and the Brahminic religions came back. Now, Sri Lanka had Theravada Buddhism, and I'm speaking as a Catholic. Sri Lanka's Buddhist civilization was possible because we were an island. If we weren't an island, we would have gone the same route. So this is a shift in the tectonic plates that make us an independent people, an independent island. Now, one of our most distinguished retired ambassadors, Mr. Kalyananda Godage, wrote 2 articles in the island, followed by an article by another very distinguished civil servant, Mr. Tissa Devendra. And Mr. Godage says, the plan that will destroy Sri Lanka, I mean, he's not given to sensationalism, he's not even pro-Mahinda Rajapaksa, he was fired unfairly by the Rajapaksa administration from the post of High Commissioner in Malaysia, where he was doing very well. So he's not a propagandist for Mahinda. He says, I checked this out and I found out who this idea came from. Because, you know, let's be fair by India. India is not going to send a project proposal to the Asian Development Bank if it hasn't got an okay from the country concerned. And Mr. Godage says in writing in the island that the person who came up with the suggestion was Mr. Wickramasinghe as Prime Minister in the year 2002. So these are what the Americans would call the big ticket items out there. Then you have the TNA, which kicked off its election campaign on the 25th of July in Marudanar Madam in Valikamam North, close to Uduve, with Mr. Sambandan in the chair. And every speaker mentioned that their undisputed leader was Vedapilla Prabhakar. The crowd cheered, whistled, started dancing at the mention of Prabhakar. That's the TNA. And the TNA has called for the recognition of the right of self-determination and a federal system. Federalism is okay, it's debatable, I'm not for it, but you can debate it. But in no federal country, including India, does any regional unit or any ethnicity have the right of self-determination. The Kashmir is asking for that, and they are in jail, because that leads to the breakup of a country. Then you have the UNP. And I'm not talking about what's in the social media. I'm talking about the Sunday Times, which is in fact owned by Prime Minister Wickramasinghe's family. The Sunday Times political column of August 2 says that the Deputy Minister of the UNP, Vijayakala Maheshwaran, was due to open a T20 cricket tournament at Hindu College, Jaffna, and she flatly refused to hoist the Sri Lankan flag, because she said, no, I never do this. This flag, I never hoist it. Now that's in the Sunday Times. Now when I take all of these together, I can see that if Mr. Wickramasinghe wins, we are headed one way. If Mahinda Rajapaksa wins, we are not headed that way. We may be headed in another way. Now it's a personal choice. It depends on where you're coming from.
So how confident are you it's not the harm's way, that they won't be leading us into...
Well, I think if somebody can propose in 2002 that India and Sri Lanka be linked physically, I think that's deadly dangerous, because we are protected by our border. Then we won't have a border. I mean, look at what's happened to the channel which links France and Britain. There are illegal immigrants trying to rush through that tunnel. I mean, look at the demography. We are a relatively small island with a relatively small population.
So you think President Maithripala Sirisena would allow it?
Well, Mr. Wickramasinghe is going to be... Mr. Wickramasinghe, President Sirisena told us on television that he asked the Prime Minister to remove Mr. Arjuna Mahendran as Governor of the Central Bank. Did that happen? No. The Prime Minister basically ignored what President Sirisena requested. So, I have no faith that he would comply with a request by President Sirisena.
Well, Dr. Dan, you were talking about the 13th Amendment.
Yeah.
And you were instrumental in at least...
I'm a defender of the 13th Amendment.
But
I still defend it.
Didn't you put that on the table when the US resolution was passed, as in on a condition that the 13th Amendment will be fully implemented?
No, there was no condition. What happened was that the text of President Rajapaksa's joint communique with the Government of India on May 21st, 2009, and the text of his joint communique with Secretary General of the UN Ban Ki-moon were included in the resolution at the suggestion of the group of countries that supported us, and there was no problem in doing that. In fact, Rohit Bogalagama, who was the foreign minister at that time, called me on a conference call with Dr. Palitha Kohana, who's now back in Sri Lanka, who was the foreign secretary, and said, Dan, use the language of the joint communiques. So that is what happened, and there was no problem at all, because what we are discussing now as dangerous goes way beyond the 13th Amendment. Prime Minister Modi came over here and said, go beyond the 13th Amendment. Nobody ever said that to us before. The 13th Amendment is one thing. Going beyond it is something else. The TNA is calling for federalism. That's way beyond the 13th Amendment, is way beyond the unitary state. The UNP has a deputy minister who refuses to hoist the Sri Lanka flag. That's not the 13th Amendment. Jayalalitha calls for the 13th Amendment to be a springboard for Tamil Eelam in a memorandum to the Prime Minister of India. That's not sticking by the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment is not the problem. The problem is that the TNA is not willing to accept the 13th Amendment, and that they have been consistently wanting to move beyond the 13th Amendment.
The 13th Amendment.
That's the problem.
So, but when you came back to Sri Lanka from Geneva,
yeah,
you realized that you lost your job, as in you will
No, I came back because I had lost my job.
So
I was fired.
So on what basis were you removed from your post?
Well, they didn't give me a reason. They didn't give me a reason, so and the results have been very obvious, because there was an attempt to bring a war crimes resolution in 2009. We defeated that. We got more votes for us when I was ambassador than the Americans managed to get against us from 2012 to 2015. So that was the broad coalition that we succeeded in building. There's a minister who seems to take credit to flew into Geneva, but he was the guy who was there when we lost in 2012. So after that, they removed me, and they never won after that. We kept on losing, and the resolution which we prevented in 2009 was in fact endorsed, and now you have this unprecedented war crimes inquiry, not by the Human Rights Council, but by the Office of the High Commissioner. I think that was part of a process that started with my dismissal and ended on January 8th with Mahinda Rajapaksa being removed from office. I think that what happened with my removal was a small precursor, just a microcosm of what happened on January 8th. And I think the administration of that day, the Rajapaksa administration, was maneuvered and manipulated and misled by various proxies. One of the people who pushed for my ouster was Trumpika Ranawaka in the cabinet and outside the cabinet, and he lobbied certain high officials. So I think it was all part of the same maneuver, and the results have been very obvious. The gates opened in Geneva, we lost. Sri Lanka started losing, and then we lost the north, because in the north and east, the diaspora put pressure on the TNA and said, look, we are winning out there, don't cut a deal with this Rajapaksa guy. So the TNA kept on escalating its demands, and finally it came home to the south, and President Rajapaksa lost the election on January 8th. I think, I hope that the lessons have been learned.
Okay. With elections just around the corner, I would like to ask you, just a yes or no answer. Politicians, they promise like an assortment of candy, but at the end of the day, the common man only gets bread or water. True or false?
Yes, this is true.
So we will have more of that after this short commercial break. So see you on the other side. Well, welcome back to Vantage Point. Well, just before the break, we were just talking about promises that are yet not fulfilled, and promises that need to be kept by politicians. Dr. Dan, just briefly tell us as to what needs to be changed and what should be done for these promises to get to the masses, to go out there and to reach out to the people. Because promises are made on a platform where, you know, politicians say that they promise stuff, they promise this and everything else. But at the end of the day, when they get power, it's just so difficult to get to the masses. It takes a lot of time. It's a huge process. So what needs to be done to, you know, to do it swiftly, to make sure that it's done fast?
Well, it's like in life or in employment or whatever. You have two people, I mean, you know, in any walk of life, two people who are promising you stuff. It could be a friend, it could be two friends. One is somebody who has delivered in the past on big stuff, and then made mistakes and so on and done some bad stuff, but when it comes to delivering on promises, making changes, getting you from point A to point B, he's done it, right? So, and then the other guy, not so much. So therefore, if I had to choose, I would, in my own interests, I would even hold my nose and go with the guy who has delivered before, rather than the guy who's been around for a long time but who hasn't delivered anything like it. So that, I don't want to go beyond that. And when I look at the two, to me, Mahinda Rajapaksa did something that four other presidents, prime ministers couldn't do, and which is a big deal even when I look at the world around me now with terrorism all over the place. And then he at least began the process of a rapid modernization of the economy in the post-war period, and ensured a high growth rate. Now, as far as Mr. Wickremesinghe goes, we've had 7 months, and garbage is piling the streets in Colombo, and street vendors are back, and there's not a single thing that I can see that's new that he has initiated, except for his famous Volkswagen story. I contrast that with the UNP under Ranasinghe Premadasa, who was elected with 2 civil wars in the south and in the north. And as he came in, he kicked off a huge program of Janasavya, with round 1 taking place in the worst area in the whole country, Hambantota, where the JVP was dominating. So the UNP usually hits the ground running, and Mr. Wickremesinghe didn't do that. And he didn't do that when he was Prime Minister in 2001, 2004, except for the ceasefire agreement. I say that because he was ousted by President Kumaratunga, but President Kumaratunga immediately went for an election, a parliamentary election. And if the people felt that, hey, this guy did something good for us, they would have re-elected him. But they endorsed what Chandrika did, and he was defeated, and and Mahinda became PM because there was a defeat for the UNF. So when I look at the track record, I don't see Mr. Wickremesinghe as somebody who has ever really delivered. Even if I go back to the time when his uncle was president and they had a 5-6 majority in parliament, Mr. Wickremesinghe was Minister of Education, 1977 through, for a long time. You know, there wasn't a single scholarship program that he initiated. There was a scholarship program under the UNP, by the way, a very important one. But it took Mr. Lalit Athulat Mudali, whom I had a lot of ideological problems with, But I have no hesitation in saying that that is the man who kicked off the Mahapola scholarship program for poor students, high-performing poor students. Lalit was Minister of Trade, and then he was Minister of National Security. Mr. Wickramasinghe, as Minister of Education, did not initiate a single scholarship program for the students. So I'm not confident that he's a person who delivers for the better. I have seen him delivering stuff such as the CFA, and therefore I think it's really no contest between Mahinda Rajapaksa, who delivered peace, and then Sri Lanka, in which even in the north and east you can hardly tell that there was a war.
And Dr. Dan, him winning the war, or him
giving
political leadership. And don't you think it was all that work and effort that was done long time back, and the groundwork was just laid by politicians and leaders who were holding positions even before him, and at the end he took the victory for it. So don't you think it's years and years of work that ended up where, fortunately, where he was president and we won the war? So rather than just, making sure that he gets all the credit for it, don't you think it's a lot of work that was done years and years ago?
It's a fair question. But Stephanie, I look at the facts, and the facts are these. As we speak today, we are about to commemorate the 10th death anniversary of our finest foreign minister ever, Lakshman Khadirgaon. Now, Lakshman Khadirgaon was killed in 2005. Mahinda took over in December. So after all these years and efforts made by the previous leaders, our foreign minister was assassinated in his own home by a sniper from across the street in the residential area of Colombo, who shot him 4 times. That's how well we were doing in the war before Mahinda came in. Right? And let's continue to talk about Lakshman Khadirgaon. In the year 2000, 5 years before Mahinda came in, Lakshman Khadirgaon had to talk to the government of India because the Tigers had got our major camp under control in Elephant Pass, and they were threatening Jaffna. And the Indians said, sorry, we can't assist you. The only thing we can do is we can help you evacuate. And buses lined up in Jaffna, were lined up in Jaffna with name boards of the various army units, and they were ready for evacuation. Luckily, we managed to hold on, but we barely held on. That's how brilliantly we were doing before Mahinda. And it's Mahinda who turned it around. I don't understand why Chandrika and Ranil and all these people who were there before couldn't do it, because Chandrika was president and Ranil was prime minister after 9/11 as well. Ranil came in after 9/11. Chandrika was president through. And there was a global atmosphere against terrorism. Chandrika was the daughter of 2 prime ministers. She was almost assassinated by Prabhakar. And what did she do after the assassination? She should have gone all over the world and said, look, help me deal with this most deadly enemy. They even killed Rajiv Gandhi. And she would have got the assistance. She had a political package as well. Instead, she asked the Norwegians to come and negotiate. That's what happened. So we were far from the efforts of the others. The others just made us look at the map of Sri Lanka when Mahinda Rajapaksa took over. The Tigers were all over. Colonel Mutalif of military intelligence was shot in Pamankad, in his car. That's how hollowed out we were. And that's what Mahinda inherited. And by the time he finished, in 3.5 years, he had cleaned the place up and defeated the most ruthless terrorist army in the world at that time.
And Dr. Zan, don't you think the means in which one uses or one utilizes to get to a goal is important?
Yes.
The road is important.
Yes.
How you get there is important.
Yeah.
So no matter what you use to get there, you just get there. But don't you think the way in which it should be done should also be made clear?
Absolutely.
So why do you think the former presidents were unable to do what former President Mahinda Rajapaksa was able to do? What do you think they both didn't have in comparison?
Well, nobody before Mahinda thought the war could be won and therefore tried to win it, because they're the same army. I mean, Mahinda didn't inherit a new officer corps. General Fonseca was commanding Jaffna under Ranil
So you think
Chandrika.
he took the ethical way to do it, as in?
I think he took the only way available, given the nature of the Tigers and the fact that the Tigers had killed everybody who tried to talk to them,
So
including
you think he
Rajiv
was
Gandhi.
ruthless?
No, I think, to quote President Obama, who in fact got it from philosophers, such as very contrasting philosophers, Machiavelli and Kant, he said the only just war is a necessary war. That war had become necessary. Why? I'll tell you why. Let's say you're a surgeon. You have a patient who has, cancer spreading. Now, you have to go in and you have to do a big operation. But you also hear, or or we know, that years ago, the operation could have been done before the cancer had spread so far, and it was one simple operation, but some dumb surgeon decided not to do it, or the dumb patient decided not to do it. I'll tell you what happened. And this is not me. This is not Mahinda Rajapaksa. This is Professor Paul Moorcraft. I've said this before, but I think it warrants retelling. Professor Paul Moorcraft of Britain is a former senior instructor at the legendary, I might say iconic, Sandhurst Military Academy in Britain. They decided they needed to know how we won the war. So he was commissioned to write a book. He wrote the book called The Total Destruction of the Tamil Tigers, because this was new, to be able to totally destroy such a strong terrorist army which had a naval network and so on. And this was published by Pen and Sword Publishers, a publisher of military books in London. Now they launched the book there. Then he decided, well, logic, have a book launch in Sri Lanka. So he came over here, and I was invited to give the main lecture. He was chairing. So I had to read the book. And when I read the book, Stephanie, I was horrified. I have no words really to describe my feelings when I read that. The book says, and frankly, I'm not even sure Mahinda Rajapaksa has read the book, though he doubtless knows the facts. The book says that on the 20th of December 2001, a long-range reconnaissance patrol of the Sri Lankan Army Special Forces was lying in wait in the Mullaitivu jungle because they knew that any day from the 22nd through to Christmas, December 25th, Velupilla Prabhakaran was surely going to be there. Now, their intelligence was very good because in the months previously, they had assassinated 8 top LTT leaders. Mind you, no civilian casualties, just these guys. Ranil Wickremesinghe, as Prime Minister, called it off. The army commander, Mr. Balagala, now all of this is in the book. General Balagala pleaded with him, said, do not do this, sir. Either we will win the war by decapitating the Tigers, or you will have a successful peace negotiation, because they will come to the negotiating table weakened. He is the hardest line guy there. If we remove him, you can come to a peace deal. The book says that Prime Minister Wickremesinghe refused to listen to them, and he called off the operation. And what is worse, and this is something we do know about, that that particular operation had a intelligence backup in Aturugiriya at Millennium City. That's where the Directorate of Military Intelligence was operating in a safe house, backing up this Mullaitivu, the deep penetration operation. He raided that, got those guys locked up, and they were interrogated. I mean, they are tough people, but they were talking to their own government. I mean, they were interrogated by the state, so they had to answer questions truthfully. Somehow, the names leaked of all their sources, and 42 military personnel and a total of 246 Tamil sources of information were tortured and eliminated by the Tigers. Now, that is the surgery in 2001 that could have ended this war without a large-scale war that Mahinda had to fight, without civilian casualties, without the criticism from the United Nations that we got subsequently. Ranil stopped it. So the person who stopped The surgical way out is the one who is morally responsible for every life. Sinhala, Tamil, soldiers, tigers, civilians, that was lost between that time and the time we won the war in May 2009. That's a moral responsibility.
So was the ceasefire during that time, or the ceasefire was
Stephanie, the ceasefire again, that again is a shocker, because Chandrika didn't know about the ceasefire. She's the president. She asked for 24 hours to study it, and this is what Lakshman Kadirgama told me. By the way, he was in the room. He said, Ranil said, no, I have promised Prabhakaran I'm going to sign this at 5 o'clock today. That day, he brought it to Chandrika, the day that he was going to, let Chandrika say it's a lie. That's fine. Because this is something that Lakshman told me. He refused to let Chandrika study this for 24 hours. And I've been a critic of hers, but I must say this, to her credit, she said, then I'm sorry, I can't agree to this. I am not part of this. I can't agree to this. He didn't show it, Ranil didn't show this CFA to cabinet. He didn't get the cabinet endorsement. And what did the CFA say? It allowed the Tigers to go back into Jaffna, which our soldiers had liberated in December 1995 under General Jerry De Silva. But it didn't allow the state to go into the areas that the Tigers controlled. So it was entirely one-sided. And in any case, if you take serious peace negotiations like the famous Paris peace talks, which brought an end to US involvement in Vietnam in 1973, the two armies keep fighting until the final agreement, until success. In fact, sometimes they fight in order to have a stronger hand at the negotiating table. What General Balagala explained to Prime Minister Wickremesinghe is this is going to help you in negotiations, because this is the guy, Prabhakaran, who always walks out on negotiations. And even his own people like Mahathir, who want to continue negotiations, are then tortured and killed. So let's get rid of this guy, it will help peace. But Ranil said no. So that is moral responsibility. And I'm afraid I have to juxtapose this with something else. Now, he was very soft on Prabhakaran. Now, you've heard about Batalanda. I don't know what happened, and I don't know what went on, whether Mr. Wickremesinghe had anything at all to do. I'm willing to say, I don't know. I just don't know. I'm not even implying that he did. But I do know two things. One, there was the Batalanda Commission headed by 3 retired Supreme Court judges in the year 2000, and the report came out. It confirmed that there was a major torture and extermination center in Batalanda, and that many innocents were also killed. There were JVP suspects who were killed, and there were innocents who were killed in the most unspeakable manner, and the interior was still blood-stained. This is what the commissioners said in the report. That I know. I also know that we have had 3 terrible insurgencies in this country in April 71, then the 30-year war in the north, and then the second JVP insurgency in the 80s. And there were ministers who had to deal with it. Felix Das Baranayaka in 71, Ranjan Vijayaratna, Sirisena Kure, Lalit Atulat Mudali, these were people who handled the crackdown. Never in Sri Lankan history, or in fact in the history of any other part of the world that I know of, did any senior minister leave his residence in the capital, which is easy to defend. Mr. Wickremesinghe's residence was in Inner Flower Road, he still is, or Cambridge, Inner Flower Road, and take up residence in a part of a complex that is a torture and extermination center. That's very strange. Felix never did that, Lalit never did it, Ranjan never did it, Sirisena Kure never did it. Why would anybody leave their residence in Inner Flower Road, which is easy to protect because it's Colombo, and take up residence? Look, Stephanie, I don't know whether you had this experience, I hope not, but I am still haunted by memories of a dog who was run over, which I saw as a child.
But there's no credible evidence.
Yeah, but why would somebody leave his residence and go and take a flat in part of a torture and extermination center? Isn't that strange? So to me, it's anomalous, at the very least, it's anomalous behavior. It's uniquely anomalous behavior. And I have what the Americans would call, I mean, the Americans have these terms, these things, they say it raises reasonable doubt about character issues. I don't have that problem with Mahinda Rajapaksa.
Well, with that, we go in for a short commercial break. Well, welcome back. Dr. Dan, now we spoke a lot about politics, and let's just talk about you. What is your political position? As in, do you see yourself as a conservative, socialist, or a liberal? Now, it's something that I may not ask from anyone else, but it's only right that I ask from you, because you've been talking about a lot of changing things in the political arena. So it's only right to know what your political position is.
Well, I'm a bit of a mix, a fusion. But from the age of 13 to 30, I would say I was a socialist, even a Marxist. Since then, I would call myself a social democrat, more center-left than left. But very broadly speaking, I'm from and off the left, which really means that in the United States, I'd be a Democrat rather than a Republican. You know, but I have a bit of conservatism in me too, in terms of certain values, patriotism, national security, a strong state. In that sense, that perhaps is part of a conservative political agenda, but I'm not a conservative really in any sense of the word. There's just that part of the mix. Overall, I'm very liberal when it comes to individual rights and freedoms and cultural matters. So in that sense, there's a strong liberal democratic inheritance. But overall, I would say I'm a social democrat. I'm broadly left of center.
And the country is now heading towards which type of political position? And what do you think the masses like, pursuing, having for themselves?
Well, I think that in Sri Lanka, as in many parts of the world, the public is usually at the center, not dead center, but it tends to gravitate towards the center. And I see I've supported President Ranil Singh Premadasa, so I have no problem with the United National Party. I've never been a party member, I'm not an SLP member. But Mr. Wickramasinghe has always been on the far right of the UNP, and I say this because of a certain fact. He organizationally affiliated the UNP with a thing called the International Democratic Union, which is the global alliance of parties of the right. It's co-chaired by the US Republicans and the British Conservative Party. Now, no UNP leader, including Jaya, ever did that. They were very careful to remain very flexible. Jaya was a friend of Fidel Castro's, just as he was a friend of Ronald Reagan's. But Mr. Wickramasinghe is a hardcore rightist, except when it came to the North and Prabhakaran, which is, his policy was quite, as somebody said the other day, like the Green Party, overseas. So I think he's way too far out in right field, so I am not in sympathy with him. If there had been another leader of the UNP, close to the center, like Karu or Sajid, I might have been far more sympathetic. But I think Mr. Wickramasinghe is an anomaly. He's too far to the right, ideologically, but in a strange sense, that which is right about the right globally, that they are very tough on terrorism and very patriotic, that he doesn't have. Mahinda Rajapaksa is, and has always been, broadly speaking, center-left. I mean, his uncles, George and Lakshman Rajapaksa, these are people who were with, on the left of SWRD Bandaranaike's coalition and Mrs. Bandaranaike's coalition. Mahinda has always been associated with kind of center-left causes. He's a populist. He's essentially a populist.
A nationalist?
He's a nationalist, but he's as much a populist or even more populist than he's a nationalist. But he's a nationalist populist. But of a center-left sort. There are nationalist populists of a center-right sort. He's center-left. He always identified himself in the broadest, most elastic sense as left, and the UNP or Ranil as right. So I'm personally much more comfortable with him. But as I said, it's ideological and it's personal. I like his track record. It's nothing to do with party, because I did support President Premadasa for roughly the same reasons that I support Mahinda Rajapaksa. I think they are strong, patriotic leaders.
But then you
with a lot of economic and developmental drive.
And you also said that he could be also a nationalist, which
he is. I think he is.
So does that make sense when it comes to, taking the minorities into the whole calculation?
Yeah, I look at what he did rather than what people say about him. We have democracy in the north because Prabhakaran is dead. Otherwise, the TNA, including friends of mine and my father's like Neelan Tiruchelvam, friends of mine like Thiranagama, Dr. Rajani Thiranagama, the progressives were all wiped out by the Tigers. There is democracy and even an anti-Mahinda sentiment possible in the north and east, because he liberated it from the Tigers, and he had every possible kind of election, starting in 2009.
And militarization also comes into that.
Well, militarization is really at its height when there's a war. When there's no war, there's less militarization.
But they were in civil.
There will always be a military presence, Stephanie, in the north, because it's a border area. I mean, even long before the war, there was a military presence called TAFI, Task Force Anti-Illicit Immigration, because of South India. And in any country where there's a border which is ethnically sensitive, in the sense it is co-ethnic.
But it terrorizes civilians.
Sorry?
It terrorizes civilians to have people with uniforms just walking around you when you go to a town, when you go to a shop. It terrorizes
Well, Stephanie, I think they were far more terrorized when the Tigers came in and took children. I mean, there are reports of the University Teachers of Human Rights, Jaffna, of families that buried their children to save them.
But most women say that they felt very protected, they felt safe.
Under the fascists, under the Tigers?
Being around, as in...
Being asked to blow themselves up. Women suicide bombers basically turned into robots. That's liberation.
They were not harassed. As in, that's what they view it as in, they were not harassed.
Well, I'm sure, Stephanie, that there are those who felt that under Hitler and Mussolini, they were not harassed. But that just shows that they're sick in the head. Because, and again, I'm not talking about Sri Lanka. I'm talking about Professor Walter Lacker, who was the editor of the Penguin Pelican Reader's Guide on Fascism, which we studied as university students. That was in the 70s. Who wrote a book in 1999 called The New Terrorism. He's Professor Emeritus. And Walter Lacker said that for its ruthlessness and fanaticism, the only parallels he can see for the Tamil Tigers of Sri Lanka are the European fascist movements of the 1920s and 1930s. That's Hitler and Mussolini. This is Professor Walter Lacker. So if somebody is praising the way things were under the Tigers, then they need to go see some professionals about it.
So you think the women were safe back then in the former administration? Or even, I can bring this into account, where there was poor representation of women in Parliament, about close to 5.7% of them. And in fact, the minister to overlook the Ministry of Women's Affairs was in fact a man.
Stephanie, how can you even compare that with the fact that women were running and hiding because there was a war on? They were either getting killed, they were cannon fodder, or their children were getting killed, or, if you were in a border village, you could be hacked to death. There are photographs of babies hacked to death by the Tigers and mothers hacked to death by the Tigers.
People were raped. Women were raped and harassed.
Stephanie, there are 20 million people in this country. Not all the women of Sri Lanka live in the north.
But most of them who lived in the north.
No, most women in Sri Lanka didn't live in the north. You had women in the north and the south whose sons and daughters couldn't go on a school bus because they might be blown up. Husbands and wives who are women, didn't go with their husbands in the same bus or the same vehicle. They went at different times. They were scared that their children would die. There's a woman who was blinded when the central bank bomb impacted on the Selinco, and she was an executive. The glass cut her eye. I mean, the women victims of this war that the Tigers waged, and I say the Tigers waged because whenever there was a peace agreement, it's the Tigers who reneged on it. Chandrika is a woman, she's minus one eye. I mean, there are so many women who were turned into widows. The Tigers were the main widow maker on this island.
I'm
right? So, if you're talking about women, the very fact of peace gave women another chance to fight for their rights. And if they want to fight against Mahinda Rajapaksa for their rights, fine. But he enabled it. It was possible because they were no longer having to worry about whether their children were going to be blown up on a school bus.
Okay, equality. You think that will be possible when the former president comes into power, becomes prime minister? Will that be equality, at least in parliament, where women will be represented more?
Well, women have to push for that, but...
yes, there was a bill that was tabled, but it never went
Stephanie,
through.
when the economy of this country, the commanding heights of the economy in any country, in any part of the world, is the central bank. In other parts of the world, it's called the Federal Reserve Bank. When that is handed over to somebody who's not even a citizen of the country, and I'm not talking about Sinhalese and Tamil, because my friend Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy would have been a brilliant governor of the central bank, but they didn't give him the job, though he was on the short list. They brought in somebody who has no responsibility towards this country because he has relinquished his citizenship of Sri Lanka, and they put him in charge of the central bank of this country, which tells me that if Mr. Wickremesinghe wins, men, women, all of us who are Sri Lankans are not going to be the equal of somebody who is not the citizen of a country, and there will be a huge diasporification of people who are not even the citizens of Sri Lanka being handed over chunks of our economy. All of us, Sinhalese, Tamils, all of us who are Sri Lankans are going back to the colonial period where we were all second-class citizens. I'd much rather take my chances with Mahinda Rajapaksa.
And Dr. Dan, the current Prime Minister, he didn't have a, let's say, an iron grip around terrorism. He didn't have...
He had an iron grip around his party,
but...
And he had an iron grip on, during the southern terrorist
So,
uprising.
don't you think he was going for a more ethical approach in mitigating terrorism?
Which is why he shifted his residence to Batalanda. Ethical approach to mitigating terrorism. No. When it comes to the south, he was ruthless as hell. But when it came to the north, he was a wimp. I like consistency in people.
So, okay, there's only a few days more for the election. So, what would you like to tell our viewers just before elections? And what choice do you think they should make when it comes to voting the next Prime Minister?
Well, if you want Sri Lanka to be connected to India with a $3.6 billion underwater tunnel through which ships and lots of other things and people can come, vote for Ranil, because it was his idea in the first place, according to Mr. Kalyananda Godage. If not, vote for Mahinda. Don't waste a vote on the JVP because Anura Kumara Dissanayake is not going to be the Prime Minister. This is about who the Prime Minister is going to be.
Okay, with that, we wrap up this edition of Vantage Point. So it was my pleasure to be your host. Happy elections.